Değerli konuklar, sevgili izleyiciler, iş dünyasının önde gelen yapıcı ve geliştirici yaklaşımlarını konuştuğumuz Fikir Önderleri yayınımıza hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Yine bugün dünyanın çok önemli üniversitelerinden birinden çok değerli bir öğretim üyesiyle birlikte olacağız ve ortaya koyduğu çok önemli bir yaklaşımı konuşacağız. Ama kendisiyle sohbete geçmeden önce birkaç hatırlatmayı sizlerle paylaşmayı arzu ediyorum. Malumunuz yayınlarımız Instagram, YouTube ve Twitter üzerinden aynı anda canlı olarak gerçekleşiyor. Bize konuğumuza soru yöneltmek isterseniz sizi YouTube kanalımıza rica edelim. Oradaki sohbet kutucuğunu kullanarak bize sorularınızı iletebilirsiniz. Evet değerli dostlar, sevgili izleyiciler, dijital dönüşüm günü bugün bizim için. Öğleden önce bayağı uzunca süren ve ciddi çok değerli konukların olduğu bir dijital dönüşüm zirvemiz vardı. Onun ardından da bu akşamki canlı yayınımızı da tamamlayıcı bir konuyla seçtik. Gerçekten de çok değerli, çok farklı bir bakış açısıyla bu konuya da ciddi katkı veren çok kıymetli bir isimle birlikte olacağız. Columbia Business School'dan Rita McGrath bizlerle birlikte olacak. Rita, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure, Rita. Let's start with a broad question. I like asking broad questions for the icebreaker for my guests. So today I was mentioning in Turkish that we had another conference in the evening, between afternoon and evening, if I may say, about digital transformation. And also when we talk about digital transformation or when we publish another article about digital transformation, people were like, it's digital transformation again. So do you think this term is overrated or we have been using it in a wrong way?
I don't think it's overrated, but I think what it reflects is the pattern of how digital technologies have moved through our organizations and through our businesses. So digital, if you think about it, really started off firstly, deep analytics, you know, the original search engines that the military used, right? That was where digital really began. Then from a consumer point of view, it was in marketing. And so, you know, everybody had to have a URL and a website and the first e-commerce sites. And all the really serious business people kind of looked at it and went, well, you know, fine, marketing. And if you think about it, a lot of the digital operations were under the marketing department. That's originally where it started. Then we start to see digital coming into products. And so today you can't buy a hammer online, you know, without reading the review that says, oh, I left this hammer out in the sun and the handle melted and don't buy this, you know. And so you started to now have two-way communications between organizations and their constituencies. And why I think the digital transformation concept is so much on the agenda right now is that now digital's gotten into business models. And it's making old models obsolete. It's making new models possible. And it really is now forcing organizations to radically change the way that they do business. So I think each time it's come up along that life cycle, you know, you've seen a different view of, oh, marketing is going to be digitally transformed. And it was, oh, products, you know, are going to be digitally transformed. And now it's actual company operations and business models.
Right. Especially for the business models, we have been seeing a lot of new business models coming through. In every industry, we have been witnessing new business models. So there is a kind of a really new, really value-creating business models going on. And I totally agree with you. This is the main idea behind this digital transformation efforts. But also, there are lots of research or papers saying that the majority of the digital transformation initiatives are not delivering the expected value or even failing. You know, there's a famous statistic saying that 75% of digital transformation projects either fail or either became short of delivering the expected value. So why is this the case? Why we are so much aware of the importance of digital transformation, but we are not capable enough to make it deliver?
Well, I think, you know, in a way, digital transformations and large computer projects in general have the same problem large innovation projects have had forever, which is you're dealing with really high levels of assumptions that you need to make relative to knowledge that you have. And so when something's seen as important and urgent and we've got to get this done, there's a tendency on the part of business leaders to treat it like a commando mission, you know, and so we're going to marshal the resources, we're going to put all this money behind it, we're going to put a crackerjack team of 25 people on this thing, and we're going to go because we need to do this quickly and there's a sense of urgency. And here's the dilemma: human learning doesn't work that way. So if you let a project start out really big with lots of pressure behind it and lots of people behind it, what'll tend to happen is they'll fix very early on what they think the right answers are. And yet, in a condition of high uncertainty, you don't know what those answers are. And so you're better off with what I call a discovery-driven approach, where you say, I'm going to keep the resources, at least in the beginning, very small, very focused. We're going to be very specific about what we want to learn. We're going to demonstrate some early success, but in a narrow kind of way, and then we're going to spread out from that success. So we can't give you a 2-year plan for our digital transformation, because what I need to give you is a 2-week plan. And that's a different way of approaching things.
Yeah, that reminds me of the famous framework by John Kotter, which starts with creating sense of urgency. So I think there's a certain amount of sense of urgency naturally going through in many industries, but you are totally right. The quick win approach is very important. So you have to win and then move to the other target and win, and then scale it throughout the organization. This is what we have been talking about, scaling and acceleration of the digital projects. But still, I see that lots of leaders are falling the trap of creating big elephant-like projects and cannot swallow those. So in your article about discovery-driven digital transformation, which was published in our magazine a couple of months ago, there was a really simple question. You were asking, what is your digital strategy? This question makes most of the leaders fall into panic. So before I ask why you are thinking about this, I would like to ask the same question to you. What is digital strategy? How can we define digital strategy?
Well, I think it's a mistake to lead with digital is the first problem. It's just like with any strategy. You need to have a coherent way of making choices that will lead to value creation and differentiation for your customers. And so I think before you start with digital, and this is one of the big problems, right? People say, oh, I want some of that blockchain, or sprinkle some of that, AI and pixie dust on my operations and everything's going to be fine. That's the wrong place to start. Those things are tools, right? And so where I think you need to begin with a strategy, you start with your constituents, in most cases your customers. You define what arena that you want to compete in, and then you look at what the technologies are that will give you the capabilities to do that. So I'll give an example. There's a terrific company called Medidata, which is one of the world's most important companies that aggregate oncology data. And so the way medicine is practiced, even in most parts of the world, it's locked, data is locked away in file cabinets and doctors' offices, and it's manual, and you can't see the bigger patterns. Whereas what Medidata did, and the reason they did it was because one of their co-founders was actually doing medical research and spent half the time just assembling the data that he needed to run his analyses. And he was exploring prostate cancer in men. And this is back in the early days of treatment for that. And what he was trying to find was the correlation between a certain level of, they call it PSA in your blood, and the probability that you had cancer. Well, if you think about it, that's a very interesting and important data question. And if you can't aggregate data in a meaningful way, you can't answer that question. So if you've only got a sample of 10, you can't really reliably say whether the predictor and the outcome are in sync. Whereas if you've got samples of 100,000, 200,000, a million, now you can start to get pretty confident in the correlations that you're finding. So I think the first question you want to get to is the question of, does this predictor predict an outcome which suggests an action? Now I get into the technology of how do I make that? How would I find that? What do I need to make that happen? And that's, to me, a better way of going about it than saying, let's start with massive databases and see what we can find.
That's really interesting. And also I'm a little bit sad now because the prostate cancer terminology that you have mentioned seems to be very similar to me, or very relevant to me. So this is the reason, or this is the signal that I'm getting a little bit older. So I have to take this into my agenda as well. And besides that, why does this, what is your digital strategy question makes most of the CEOs and companies fall into panic?
Well, there's a human part and there's a technical part. So the human part is, this is new, and I mean, if you're a 50-something CEO, there's nothing worse than having some 27-year-old geek come into your office and spout off a lot of language you don't know anything about. Your background hasn't taught you to be part of that. It's all new. So a lot of the things that got you where you are as a senior leader are not part of that world. They're part of the previous world. And so I think there's a human side of just being uneasy with something that you're not familiar with. So I think that's one issue. A second issue is that it's hard to articulate. Well, I would say your digital strategy is premised on the idea that you actually have a strategy. And so when you're forced to start to talk about your digital strategy, what that can kind of inadvertently do is reveal that you really don't have a very clear strategy to begin with. So I think there's almost digital is just a subplot in a larger strategy question.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point, Rita. And then comes the concept of discovery-driven planning. In 1990s, you just introduced that concept with Ian McMillan, and it was part of product innovation methodology. And now the article that you have penned in our magazine is really eye-opening as you combine this approach with digital transformation. So let's go back to the basics a little bit. What is the concept of discovery-driven planning, and why do you think it's important?
Well, it all started with studies that we were doing of large corporate innovation failures. And so these were companies that you would think would know better, but yet when they tried to do something that took them into new markets or new technologies or new products, they failed. And they failed spectacularly. So, Euro Disney and Disney, and who knows theme parks better than Disney? And yet when they introduced Euro Disney, it went through years of losses before they were able to fix the problems. Or a thing called TV Cable Week, which was trying to unseat TV Guide. Zap Mail, which was a FedEx innovation where, before we had fax machines, they would zap mail an original document from one office to another, and you would pick it up in the second office. And awesome, right? And what we discovered when we studied these flaws was we discovered the same pattern. Untested assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for low commitment testing and pivoting, leaders personally associated with this idea of damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, I know what I'm doing. No testing of assumptions, no recognition that we were working in an assumptional world. We assumed we had facts. And unfortunately, all the money and resources up front. And so the typical way these things would happen would be, there'd be a committee meeting of some kind of the resource allocation committee, and the team promoting the project would come in with their PowerPoints and their spreadsheets, and the committee would say, go for it. And then like with the digital example I used earlier, they'll assemble this whole team and off they go, in a direction. And what we realized was that you're dealing with a fundamentally different problem when you're trying to operate a successful business. So if you think about a successful business, we know who the customers are by and large. We know what they're looking for. We understand our cost structure. We know who our suppliers are. There's a lot of experience that we've built up in that business, which allows us to predict with some confidence what's likely to happen next. When you're in a situation where you're looking for a new business, you're trying to find all those things, what you're doing is learning. You're not really proving that you know how to do something. You're discovering what those things might be. So who is the customer? What's the real need that they need to get addressed? What's the best way to get to them? What's our cost structure going to be? All those things are still to be worked out. So I think the fundamental difference is in executing against a known business model you're operating. You're operating with a basis of rich, deep experience. With a new entity, whatever that is, a new business, a new digital, a new application, you're discovering. And what we find is when you try to use the tools for one, for the other, it doesn't work. Now, the same thing applies to discovery backward. If you're putting in a major CapEx program involving nuclear plants, I don't want to see testing and learning. I want you to know exactly what you're doing. And so, I think we fall into this trap sometimes of saying, oh, one's always good and one's always bad. And that's not the case. You don't want a lot of discovery if you're in a very difficult, unsafe kind of environment.
Right, yeah. Actually, that brings us to the former point that you have mentioned, because when you look at the top CEOs, top decision makers, they always want to appear that they know what they are doing. They see the long term. They have lots of cards to play. So testing assumptions or experimentation doesn't seem to be a tool for them because they may think that that is going to make them appear weak. So I think this is changing with all the things that we have been seeing with digital technologies, because in the article you mentioned that digital technologies have changed the boundaries between firms and markets. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? Why this is important? Why the change between the boundaries of firms and markets are important?
Sure. So let's take those two topics a little bit separately. So the first is on leadership. And I think when you have, again, when you know what you're doing, you can confidently lead people into the future. But in a situation where you've got to learn what the right answer is, I think there it's a much more subtle thing. What you've got to do is set broad direction so people understand and align behind the broad direction, but recognize that the specific solutions are probably going to be discovered by someone who's not you. So an example of this would be Honeywell, and Jim Cody just retired as CEO of Honeywell, very successful and very unlikely 17-year tenure there. And his broad direction was, look, what I want to do is contain or reduce cost while growing revenue, right? And so that was consistent throughout his whole 17 years there. And he called it winning now, winning later. Now, how we're going to reduce cost, how we're going to increase revenue, I may not have all the answers to that. And he was very famous for going into a meeting, and at the end of the meeting, he would pick on the most junior person there and say, so, you've been listening to us talking, what do you think? And of course, initially the junior people were like, oh, my boss is in the room, their boss is in the room, what am I going to say something? But Cody said, no, you really owe it to us to give you your best perspective on this, because you see the world in a different way than we do. And you are coming at it from a different generational perspective, and we're depending on you to help us, to show us. And so he's not giving up decision of responsibility or giving up authority, but it's opening the opportunity to get the data that you really need. And I think it's that fine balance, right? It's my strategy is consistent, costs held, revenue increase, but the way we do that may change depending on what we learn. So let's come now to the firms and market question. So if you go back to the classic question of administrative theory, like why do we even have firms? And in the past, it was very expensive to do a whole lot of things that are not expensive today. So it was very expensive to design a product. It was very expensive to operate a global supply chain. It was very complex and costly to create a global communications infrastructure. And when something is unable to be traded on an open market. In other words, you can't have a market that establishes a value because it's unique to you, right? So you put in your own bespoke computer system. IBM's not going to bid on that because they don't know what idiosyncratic thing you've built in there. Okay, so it's unique to you, so it's hard to establish the value. You can't easily determine if you're getting a fair deal for the outputs of that thing. There's a risk of opportunism, so a trading partner could take advantage of you. Those kinds of conditions tend to lend themselves to operating within a firm or within some kind of organizational context. Now, what the digital change has done, and it's not just digital, it's other things as well, but digital is a huge part of this, is it's made contracting very transparent. So the whole rise of what people call the platform economy. So, Facebook gives its users technology for free, but in exchange uses their information to sell to advertisers. What they're doing is contracting on the basis of information, and advertisers know exactly how much they're going to get paid. I'm very concerned users don't necessarily how much they're giving up, but that's a classic platform, right? So the Zom trading platform in Germany is another classic pattern. You're creating price transparency on both sides of the transaction. So what we're seeing is this very interesting evolution from what used to be firm control, because you had all these costs and complexity you couldn't manage on a market, to marketplaces. And an interesting thing about marketplaces is, where does competitive advantage then go? Well, it no longer goes to the commodity being traded. It goes to the special services and insight that you can wrap around some part of the commodity. So the digital platform makes the commodity commoditized, and it adds value to where there's creativity or special skills or something that you can do that goes beyond just selling the stuff.
Yeah, that's really important. I was just reading a book by Thales Teixeira saying that there's a decoupling going through. So the classical value chain is decoupling. So these these disruptive new business model-oriented companies are attacking the weakest chains of the value chain and then diverting the customers to the other parts of the value chain. So that is really critical, I guess. And besides that, of course, we have the incumbents, we have the startups, and we are talking about new business models. And lots of time, the sentence ends up with doing pivoting, or pivoting to a different business model, or changing a business model. So regarding the incumbents and startups, what is the difference between their ability to change and pivot? So what are some pros and cons for both of those players?
Well, with a startup, what you got is limited resources, right? And so the whole startup process, unless you got some very reliable source of funding, is a race. You know, it's a race to find a repeatable business model against the race of your resources running out. So your pivots in those cases are bet the company decisions. If you're making a pivot and you don't have unlimited resources, or at least a comfortable cushion of resources, that could be it. You know, that chance could be your last. And so with startups, there's this a romantic notion that startups, oh yeah, they pivot and they change and they do this and that and the other thing. With incumbents, you got the opposite problem. With incumbents, and I'm not talking about the venturing arms, I'm talking about the main business of an incumbent. You've got lots of resources. They may be trapped, they're not being effectively being used. You know, they may not be where they should be, but you've got lots of resources. The challenge there is getting rid of the legacy, is getting permission to pivot. So if I go back to this hypothetical committee that's just given you money to go do this wonderful thing, and you say, oh, it's going to be purple and it's going to be global, and then you come back to them 3 months later and you say, no, it's going to be green and it's just going to be for Turkey, and they look at you and they go, well, wait a minute, that's not what we authorized. That's not what we said, okay? And so pivoting in a larger organization has a lot of political baggage.
Yeah, and regarding the change of the business model, of course, we have been seeing new companies entering different markets and challenging the incumbents there. We see it from banking to insurance to automobile industries. And then what we are suggesting is the incumbents should be changing their business model. Do you think conventional and incumbent companies need to do dramatic changes in their business models, or is there another way?
Well, it's interesting. I'm working on a project with a good colleague right now on different patterns of transformation. And we've forgotten there really are different patterns of transformation. So there's some transformations which actually are pretty gradual. So a company like FactSet, which does financial analysis here in the US, you would think they'd be very concerned about new competition, but their position has always been, we're going to change maybe by 5 or 10% every year. But if you accumulate that, right? If you look at the cumulative magic over 10 years, let's say, they changed 100% of the company. So that's a more gradual transformation. Then you have the ones where typically a company is either perceiving a massive opportunity or perceiving a massive challenge. And an example of that would be something like Adobe, which went in about a 4-year period completely changing how they did business. So they went from shrink-wrapped software, which people owned, to cloud-based software, which people bought, a really big change in business model. And it wasn't a smooth journey. It took a long time and a lot of commitment on their part. So I think it's one of those it depends situations. You know, how much is the existing model being eroded and how much do customers dislike it to suggest what you need to do going forward.
Right. Let's go back to the relationship between the discovery-driven planning and digital transformation. How can we apply the DDP concept to digital transformation? And what are some key steps, key points for that?
Well, as we lay out in the article, I think the first thing you need to be clear on is what is the outcome you're trying to drive, and not from a technology point of view, but from a customer, stakeholder, constituency point of view. So what's the external result that good looks like? And that's similar to DDP, where we said you start with what does success look like, and then work backward into what are the tests and hypotheses that you can test along the way. So you might use prototypes and mock-ups and tests, you know, various kinds of hypothesis testing to take you through a series of checkpoints. So I think the big difference is instead of a big monolithic process, we're breaking it down into what's the minimum we need to learn to have confidence to take the next step.
Great. So one of the things that you have mentioned in the article is starting by definition of the operational experience. So it is not only about digital. We have to think a more holistic picture. What is the point in this argument?
Well, I think you want to be clear, and this goes back to forcing people to look at the customer experience and what is it they want. So let's take an everyday kind of thing. I want to buy a shaving razor. You know, I'm a man and I want to get shaving. Well, if you think about the existing experience, in many cases, it's pretty negative. The razors are expensive. They get locked up, right? So you have to go find someone to unlock the container where they're stored. You have to go get them. You have to remember to go get them. That's a hassle. And so if you think about the negatives in your experience, and most businesses have very significant negatives that the providers don't even understand. So you need to understand those, because that's where your disruptors are going to take their toehold. So I'll give you another example. Limo company, right? So a friend of mine travels a lot, so she uses limos to get to the airport, you know, car services. And the first car service was great at getting her to and from, but only did things by telephone, old-fashioned kind of company. And so, you know, 9 times out of 10, it would be fine. And then the 10th time they'd get AM mixed up for PM, or they'd just forget, or somebody hadn't given a message to somebody. So that didn't work very well. Next company they used was, you know, a more digital company. So she could actually talk to people, or she could text them or whatever. But the kind of company where getting the receipt for her was a big problem. So they didn't have an automatic way of generating receipts. Now, those of you that travel for business will know, if you're traveling for a client and you're going to submit expense receipts, you can't submit that package until all the receipts are in. And so, you know, she could have $10,000 worth of airplane and hotel and everything waiting for this, you know, $100 taxi reimbursement, basically. And so she finally found another company. It's all digital. It's all seamless. She gets the invoice within 10 minutes of the trip being completed. She can do it on her phone. She can do it on a landline phone. She can do it on a laptop. And now the thing I think is important is all 3 companies did a perfectly adequate job of the job, right? Getting her from A to B. They were fine at the driving part. But what they didn't understand was the whole context in which this activity takes place and what was important to her. And the second company, I bet, never even knew why it got fired, that it, you know, it was a problem with invoicing that it could never solve. And so the third company really understood that. They understood the operational outcome that their customers were looking for.
Yeah, that reminds me the jobs to be done concept by Clayton Christensen. And the second thing is, Rita, most of the leaders or most of the people think that digital transformation is like a magic wand, so you can touch and you can solve every problem. It is such a leverage that it can be used in every problem. But you are suggesting to focus on specific problems in the article. So what is your perspective about that?
Well, you know, digital is good for some things and not so good for others, right? I mean, if you have something that can be boiled down into a routine process, and you're saving someone from having to manually remember it or review it or whatever it needs to be, then that's a suitable candidate for digitization. If you're looking at something that requires human judgment or making a more creative decision or breaking free from tradition because the past is not a good predictor of the future, then, you know, I don't know that you can program an algorithm to do that for you.
Right. And the other important part is the competition. You also suggest to identify the competition in a very solid way. And the tagline for that in the article was cast a wide net. So why do we need to cast a wide net?
Well, let's come back to your observation about jobs to be done. And so this is an idea that Tony Olwick and Clay Christensen have used for years. And their hypothesis is this: don't think about buying products and services. That's the wrong way to look at it. That what you want to think about is hiring products and services and other things to get critical jobs done in your life. And when you think about what's the job I need to get done, there might be many ways I get that job done. Or most importantly, I might decide that job's not worth doing to begin with. And so my biggest competitor is non-consumption. So I just decide not to do anything at all. So one of the things I think people underestimate is that there's lots of different ways to get a critical need met. So let's take Netflix as an example that will be familiar to everyone. Netflix has been very public about saying, you know, our competitive arena is anything you could spend your disposable time on. And one of our biggest competitors is sleep.
I totally understand. And also, for the couple of years, we have been talking about Netflix as a competitor for Harvard Business Review as well, because it's also betting on the free time of the audience. So someone can either watch a series in Netflix or can read Harvard Business Review content. So by somewhat, it is also a competitor for us. So not a very fair competition, if I may say, but at the end of the day, you're totally right with that. And the other part, as you have already mentioned, is the platform business models. Now, we have been talking so much about platform business models, and even we have been seeing some articles saying that every business should be a platform business. I'm not so much into that argument, but at the end of the day, there are some implications of the ecosystems, and you are suggesting that we should be not forgetting those implications throughout the digital transformation. So what is the relation between the platform business model and the digital transformation and the Ddp approach?
Yeah, so what I think, and it comes back to the jobs to be done, right? What we often find is that there are these brilliant innovations that are years and years ahead of their time, and yet they never took off. And you ask, well, that's puzzling. Why is that? Like, why didn't picture phones take off, you know, in 1962 when they were first introduced, when we all know today it's as obvious as anything. We need to be able to do this as human beings, right? I mean, we've wanted that for decades and decades. Why didn't it happen then? Or, you know, why didn't AOL become the dominant e-commerce platform when it had the biggest internet platform of any company back in 2000? And so you see these things. And what I would argue is you're dealing with ecosystems that are fundamentally unripe in those early stages. And so part of your challenge as a strategist is to first of all, understand where it's not ripe yet, and then come up with a strategy where you can begin to craft an ecosystem around your offering. So let's take autonomous vehicles, right? This is one of the buzzy things today, right? We're going to have flying cars. It's the Jetsons tomorrow, right? And yet, if you think about it, the technology, which everybody is focused on, that's the least of the problems. You know, AT&T actually did invent a picture phone for 1962. The technology existed. What didn't exist was everything else. So take autonomous vehicles today. It's March of 2021. What's the ownership regime? You know, what's the safety regime? What's the risk regime? How are we going to manage it when everybody wants to take the same ride at 8 o'clock in the morning? What are we going to do when everybody wants to take the same ride at 5 in the afternoon? Is this going to be a system as a service kind of thing? Are you going to have the ability to, you know, buy all different sorts of experiences inside your autonomous vehicle? Is it going to be just cars like we have now, but they can drive themselves? I mean, all those questions have not been answered. And my hypothesis would be you can't get a robust ecosystem going until we start seeing the answers to some of those questions. Similarly, if you think about past breakthroughs, so what's allowed Google to become Google today? What's allowed those big e-commerce players like Amazon to become so popular? Well, there was a whole infrastructure that had to emerge first. So if you think about 2000, let's just say year 2000, so AOL and Time Warner merge in what's often been described as the worst merger of all time, right? You know, just massive. You know. And the hypothesis was that you'd be able to merge the properties of a very talented traditional media company with the e-commerce reach and the buying power of an AOL. But if you think about it, go back to the year 2000, you know, we didn't get on the internet using high-speed broadband. What did we do? We got on the telephone or, you know, the modem, and we said,
dial-up, yeah.
Yeah, we had dial-up, and there was limited capacity. So you couldn't just surf the web, right? Because it was very slow and very clunky. So web pages were not particularly useful or attractive. They weren't great places for displaying your brand. You didn't have payment mechanisms. So you're going to give somebody you don't even know on the other end of some screen your credit card information. That doesn't sound like a good idea to a lot of people. And. So the necessary components to what would create a functioning ecosystem didn't exist back in 2000. So then we had the dot-com crash. And this is what often happens with strategic inflection points, right? You have all this hype, everybody, hype, 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 you know, e-commerce is going to eat the world. Then you have a crash and all the doubters say, see, I told you so. This is never going to amount to something. But then what you have is a few survivors. And in those early days, it was Yahoo, it was eBay, it was Amazon. You know, and they began to build this ecosystem. If you think about it, Amazon started very simply. It was books, you know, the easiest, simplest thing you could think. And in the beginning, they were not all that ambitious. They were really just learning and building these ecosystems and learning what it would take to respond to an online order and learning what it would take to provide customer service that didn't depend on people and. And of course, today they're a behemoth, but, you know, 21 years ago, they weren't so much. And they realized they had an enormous learning challenge ahead of them.
Right. And last but not least, one of the most important part of the DDP is testing the assumptions. So how can we do that? And is there a way or a framework or something like that that we can use as an anchor for testing assumptions? Because it, as you have already mentioned, it can be misunderstood and then it can cause a catastrophe if we, as you have given the example of the nuclear power plant operator. But for other businesses, what is the good way for testing the assumptions?
Well, I think it comes down to, it's essentially the scientific method, right? It's saying, here is my hypothesis. So I believe customers are going to really want a supercomputer in their pockets. You know, so that's my hypothesis. So how would I test that? Well, in the early days, you didn't know, right? You would say, will customers pay extra? Let's start from the very beginning of the mobile phone revolution. Will customers pay extra for a phone that's not tethered to a wall? And what we found was that there was a group of customers who indeed would, you know, business people primarily. But you remember what the phones were like then. I mean, they were like these big bricks, you know, and in fact, in the movie Wall Street, which I believe came out in 1988, to show you like how filthy rich Gordon Gekko was in that movie, we photographed him on the beach or something with this huge phone, right? But the assumption that got validated was this had value to somebody. And so then what you start to think about is, how do I spread out from that initial target customer to broader and broader customers? So basically you articulate a hypothesis, you come up with a reasonable way of gathering data that would support or reject that hypothesis. And then you take the next step based on what you've learned. So I'll give you another example that I think is quite interesting, having to do with user behavior. And so one of the companies I work with is a company called Varo Bank. They're an all online bank, and they serve income secure but cash flow challenged millennials, is how they describe it. So these are young people that have jobs, so they've got money coming in the door, but they haven't built up a cushion of wealth yet. So anytime a car breaks down or they need a security deposit for an apartment or anything like that, it's a cash flow crisis. And so one of the things Varo's mission is to help them fix that. So the question came up early in the design process. Well, if you're going to have a mobile bank whose main interface with your customers is a chatbot, what sort of personality should the chatbot have? And there were two warring camps, basically. One warring camp said, oh, well, these are young people, right? They want to be very casual. They want to be very friendly and interactive. And so the chatbot should be like, hey, dude, tough weekend, huh? Don't worry, got your back, emoji, emoji. You know, kind of like Venmo or something. Right? And then the other camp was, oh, no. You know, it should be Mr. Robertson. It should be very formal. This is your banking. This is your financial security. This is your life. We can't be that flip and informal. And, you know, what often happens in companies is we forget that those are two absolutely legitimate assumptions. You know, there is no evidence at this point to say one's better than the other. So how do you get some evidence? Well, you do a hypothesis test or an assumption test. And so what we did, we got two interns, one of them, and hid them in closets. One of them got to play Mr. Hey Dude, and one of them got to play Mr. Robertson. We got a few programmers to put together some wireframes. And then we lured members of our target audience into a conference room with promises of free pizza, and we had them play with the things, right? So maybe it cost $500, the whole thing, right? Soup to nuts. And what we found was when it came to real money, they hated the Hey Dude guy. They absolutely, they were like, no. That might be okay for my friend, you know, with the beers on a weekend, but not for my financial security. Now, the thing about that is the Hey Dude guys weren't correct in their hypothesis, but that's okay. It cost us no more than $500 to test which direction makes the most sense. And I think what business leaders make a mistake in doing is they'll assume a lot of certainty where they actually have no idea. I mean, I have seen people argue about unknown questions about which neither of them have any possible basis in reality, and they will go on for weeks arguing about the correctness of their point of view because they have to be right. So one of the most important things, I think, is let go of this desperate need to be right all the time because it gets in the way of testing what's true.
Right, yeah. Last but not least, Rita, how can we cascade or how can we scale this DDP mindset throughout the organization? Because it is useful in every part of the organization, even for internal initiatives as well as some external and customer-facing initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the easy way is the big boss says you don't get money for anything unless you do it this way. That's the easiest way. Unfortunately, big bosses are not always inclined to do that. And I think what you have to do is create reality by giving some demonstration projects. You know, let people see how effective it can be. Let them understand how it can help them make progress. Let them see that it de-risks, right? I mean, one of the points behind DDP is you can test a lot of things very cheaply. So $500 to test your user interface, you bet that's a good investment, right? And so you need, I think, a few early demonstrated successes. And then you need someone to carry the word, to spread the word, someone to champion the idea.
Right. Rita, thank you very much for your time for this evening. It's really a pleasure to have you. We can talk hours and hours about this, but we're running out of time. So really appreciate for being here today and sharing your experience and perspective with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, Rita. Evet sevgili dostlar, değerli izleyiciler, bugün Columbia Business School'dan Rita McGrath'ı ağırladık ve gerçekten de çok önemli bir konuyu dijital dönüşüme, deneyim ve deneyleme yaklaşımıyla nasıl değer katabileceğimizi konuştuk. Umarım sizler için de keyifli ve ilham verici bir sohbet olmuştur. Bu akşam bizlerle birlikte oldunuz ve bizi dinlediğiniz için teşekkür ediyoruz. Hepinize sağlıklı ve mutlu günler diliyoruz efendim. Hoşça kalın.